March 9, 2009, 8:50 p.m. British woman Jean Hanlon sat down at a table in a cafe in the Greek city of Heraklion. In March, most establishments were only beginning to prepare for the tourist season. The cafe was nearly empty as well. Jean took out her phone, opened her messages, and sent a friend just one word: help. Her friend called her back immediately, but something strange happened. There was no panic in Jean's voice. She sounded calm, almost too calm. So calm that her friend decided nothing serious had happened. It was the last time they ever spoke. Within hours, Jean would disappear, and the Greek police would rush to close the case. But from the very beginning, Jean's sons would be certain that someone was trying to convince them of something impossible. It would take them 17 years to prove they were right. And all those years, everything they needed to begin lifting the veil of mystery had been right before their eyes. In March 2006, 50-year-old Jean Hanlon decided to leave her beloved hometown of Dumfries, Scotland, and begin a new life on the Mediterranean island of Crete. In Britain, she left behind her job as a hospital secretary and her 3 sons, Michael, David, and Robert, who were already grown and had families of their own. Many years earlier, after Jean separated from her husband, the father of her sons, she threw herself into her work and did everything humanly possible to ensure that the boys always had the very best she could afford. As a result, she had hardly ever traveled abroad and did not take her first overseas holiday until she was 40. She and a friend went to Greece, to the island of Crete. To say that Jean loved it there would be an understatement. The island enchanted her, captivated her, and claimed her heart forever. Once all 3 of her sons had grown up, become independent, and moved into homes of their own, Jean decided she could finally fulfill her dream of moving to the island paradise. She no longer wanted to work in an office. She longed for the joy and tranquility of Crete. In 2005, she found a job with a travel company and immediately asked to be transferred to its branch on the island. She loved the sunshine, the people, the different culture, and Crete's slow, relaxed way of life. After working on the island for 3 consecutive seasons, Jean decided to move there permanently. In Scotland, she had owned a house, had a good job and a steady income, but something had been missing, and she found it in Greece. She spent the winter of 2008 on the Mediterranean island. At the time, Jean had no idea that she had less than 3 months left to live in Crete. Naturally, her sons were concerned that their mother was living alone, but she had made many new friends and assured her family that she lived in a charming, safe place, the resort village of Gouves, approximately 18 kilometers east of Heraklion. On March 11, 2009, however, her sons' fears became reality when they were told that their mother had disappeared. It is difficult to imagine what it must be like to answer a phone call bearing news like that. 1,000 thoughts race through your mind. How did she disappear? When? Why? And your brain simply refuses to believe it. Jean had last been seen on March 9th. For the most part, she had behaved as usual. That morning, she left home to take a walk around Gouves. The tourist season had not yet begun, and the village's narrow streets were almost deserted. Nevertheless, Jean often ran into one of her new acquaintances during her morning walks. That morning, she exchanged a few words with another Scottish woman, Anne Mack. In passing, Jean remarked, "Do you see that green car? It's following me," Anne would later admit. "I didn't think anything of it at the time." There had not been even the slightest hint of fear in Jean's voice. It was as though she were simply stating a fact. After her walk, she returned to her apartment. That afternoon, she had a job interview at a local bar. In March, most establishments were still preparing to open, and Jean wanted to secure work for the upcoming season. She had already worked at the bar for 2 or 3 seasons, and the owner liked the way she worked. Talkative, cheerful, and always smiling, Jean was ideally suited to dealing with customers. The interview was therefore very brief. They both knew she had the job. The owner remembered that Jean ordered a glass of wine, yet 5 or 10 minutes later, she left in a hurry without finishing it. It was as though she urgently needed to go somewhere, or as though someone was waiting for her. She said she needed to go to Heraklion. From that point on, Jean's movements became something of a mystery. Did she make it to Heraklion? Did she stop at home to change her clothes? Jean did not drive, so someone must have taken her from Gouves to Heraklion. The only thing known for certain is that the following morning, Jean failed to show up to babysit a young child belonging to some friends. She had promised to look after the child while the parents were busy. Jean was known to be extremely reliable, so there had been no doubt that she would keep her promise. But she never arrived. Jean's friends hurried to report her disappearance to the police, but they were told that Jean was an adult, and the officers could do nothing until 48 hours had passed. Nevertheless, Jean's friends informed her sons, Michael, David, and Robert, that their mother was missing. The brothers hoped it was some kind of misunderstanding, perhaps that she had simply lost her phone. But no one came forward to allay their fears. 48 hours later, 53-year-old Jean Hanlon was still missing. Her sons took the first available flight to Greece and joined the search organized by local residents. On the evening of Friday, March 13th, 4 days after Jean disappeared, a body was discovered in the port of Heraklion. It was recovered from the water about 100 meters northwest of the medieval Coules sea fortress. According to the initial examination, the dead woman was between 20 and 40 years old. There were no obvious signs that a crime had been committed. It was also unclear where or how she had entered the water, as currents could have carried the body into Heraklion harbor. The body was already badly decomposed. The coroner estimated that the woman had died 20 days earlier. Given these findings, Jean Hanlon's sons were certain that the body could not be their mother's. At first, they did not even understand why they were being asked to look at the dead woman. The police took the brothers to the morgue. First, they showed them the victim's belongings. The young men immediately recognized them as their mothers. Then came the formal identification, but no one had prepared them for what they were about to see. Their mother, the person they loved and cherished most, looked like a shell of the woman she had once been. Her hair was gone. Her eyes and the bridge of her nose were missing. Naturally, it was extraordinarily difficult for her sons to see their mother in that condition. For some reason, the police had made no effort to spare their feelings, but there was no doubt. It was Jean Hanlon. The autopsy report showed that Jean had drowned. The police concluded that her death had been an accident. She had been drinking, lost her balance, and fallen into the water. Her sons, however, were not convinced. First, although the autopsy detected alcohol in her system, the amount was extremely small. It could not have affected a healthy adult's physical condition. Second, despite living on the island of Crete, Jean did not swim, was not particularly fond of the water, and would not knowingly have put herself at risk. The brothers understood that what they knew about their mother did not match what the authorities were trying to make them believe. Michael, David, and Robert returned to Scotland, but they did not return empty-handed. After their mother's death, they found her personal diary. In it, she recorded her daily activities, plans, and thoughts. She had written it for herself, never knowing that years later it would become her voice in a courtroom. The brothers read it from beginning to end. At first glance, there seemed to be nothing unusual in it. Then they read it again. One entry caught their attention, then another. Gradually, they realized that the same person appeared on almost every page. Meanwhile, all the case materials were sent to the United Kingdom so that a British coroner could conduct an inquest. The coroner's task was to determine the cause of Jean's death. The process took 9 months. On December 12, 2009, after examining all the evidence, the British coroner concluded that Jean had not died in an accident. She had been murdered. The injuries to her body, particularly those to her head, face, and ribs, as well as the numerous bruises, were difficult to reconcile with an accidental death. Instead, they indicated a severe beating. By then, Jean's sons had also examined her diary and discovered that on the evening of her disappearance, she had met a mysterious man. These circumstances did not fit the theory that she had simply fallen into the water. It seemed that despite the time already lost, the investigation might finally move forward. The Greek police did begin working on the case. They held a press conference and released Jean's photograph. They interviewed her friends and visited every tavern, shop, and bar she had frequented. The brothers were told that the police had identified 2 persons of interest. Jean had spoken to both of them on the phone shortly before her disappearance. Over time, the 2 men were even treated as suspects because investigators were troubled by inconsistencies in their statements. It later emerged, however, that one of them was Belgian and spoke poor Greek. Some of his words had simply been misinterpreted or mistranslated. The second witness suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. He experienced a panic attack during questioning, which also made his statements appear inconsistent. Ultimately, prosecutors concluded that there was no evidence linking either man to Jean's death. They were cleared of suspicion, and the investigation reached a dead end. Jean Hanlon's sons urged the Greek police and prosecutors to continue investigating. The response was unexpected. The brothers were asked to find potential witnesses themselves and obtain their contact details. The young men had never heard of a victim's family being expected to find witnesses and evidence in place of police detectives. To their astonishment, the case was returned to the archives within a month. Disappointed by the investigators' work, Jean's sons turned to private detective Haris Flaskounis, also known as Haris Veramon. Veramon is his professional pseudonym, under which he is known as a private detective, author, and host of the true crime project, Traces in the Dark. Haris would later admit, "At first, I had absolutely no idea where to begin." Fortunately, Jean had kept a regular and detailed personal diary, so Haris began by examining it. He also investigated whom Jean might have met on the day she disappeared. It turned out that she had several meetings that Monday, both social and work-related. Some were already known about because of the Greek police investigation. During her morning walk, Jean had run into the Scottish woman Anne Mack at a shop and casually mentioned that a green car was following her. At around noon, she met an acquaintance who worked at a cafe in Gouves. While speaking to him, she glanced across the street and noticed a man she had previously dated. According to Jean, he had been following her and, as he had done several times before, was trying to persuade her to meet him. To avoid an encounter, she decided to remain in the cafe until he left. On that occasion, she managed to avoid speaking to him. That afternoon, Jean went to her job interview at the bar. As we already know, it was successful. Her day appeared to be going quite well. When Haris heard the witnesses' accounts of the mysterious stalker, he began to wonder whether the man might have been Jean's former boyfriend. January 26, 2009. He called me and invited me out for coffee. I said yes. Although Jean lived alone on the island, she was not lonely. She had made many new friends. Around the middle of February, she also began a romantic relationship with a man. On Saturday, January 24th, Jean spent the evening at a local bar, where she met someone who caught her attention. She described the budding romance in her diary. February 11th, 2009. Today we had our first date. I spent the night at his house. It was nice. Jean wrote down his name, Nikos. Unfortunately, this is one of the most common male names in Greece. February 15th. Nikos turned up at my house without warning. I invited him in, and he cooked dinner for us. At first, Jean was not alarmed by the man's persistence or his habit of appearing uninvited. She was charmed by him. Despite the initial idyll, however, something evidently happened on February 17th, 2009. Because Jean no longer wanted the relationship to continue, she wrote, "I'm not thrilled with him. I'm going to end this and stay out of relationships for a while. It isn't worth it." Nevertheless, she arranged to meet Nikos once more so she could gently explain how she felt and end their relationship. The man did not like the fact that Jean no longer wanted to see him, and he refused to accept her rejection. March 4th, 2009. Another uninvited visitor at my house. He rang the doorbell and was holding coffee and wine. He invited me to dinner on Sunday. I said I didn't think it was a good idea. He left. March 7th, 2009. On Saturday, he called again and invited me to dinner that evening. I refused. Judging by Jean's notes, the man's persistence was gradually turning into an obsession. His relentless attempts to persuade her to meet him reached their peak on March 7th and 8th. On March 9th, Jean died. According to Jean's own words, she was not afraid of Nikos, but she would have been much more cautious if she had known what he had been hiding from her all along. Haris Veramon began examining Jean's phone calls from the evening she disappeared. For several weeks, he practically lived among the records. Jean had called several friends. She told one of them that she was at the Marina Cafe in Heraklion. She was not alone. She was with a Greek man. The Greek man did not speak English very well, and Jean spoke little Greek. She therefore called her friend and asked him to help them communicate. Jean handed the phone to the man so that her friend could explain to him in Greek that she wanted him to stop stalking her. She no longer wanted to see him. Her friend did as she asked. At 8:50 p.m., however, Jean sent him a message that frightened him. It contained just one word: help. Her friend called Jean back immediately, but despite her desperate plea for help, her voice sounded perfectly calm. Everything seemed normal. She was still spending time with the same man. After reassuring himself that Jean was all right, her friend went to bed. At 9:45 p.m., Jean called him again, but he was already asleep, and the call went unanswered. No one would ever hear from Jean again. During his investigation, Private Detective Harris Verman found this friend and asked him to listen to several voice samples. Perhaps he would recognize someone. When the man heard one of the recordings, he burst into tears. It was as though he were reliving that day all over again, many years later. He recognized the voice of the Greek man with whom Jean Hanlon had spent her final evening. His name was Nikos Kotoulakis. Harris Verman then accomplished something extraordinary. Once he had identified his main suspect, he gained the man's trust and drew him into a candid conversation. The private detective recorded their exchange. Nikos did not confess to anything. However, by comparing his statements with Jean's diary entries and the facts already known to investigators, Harris managed to give the case a tremendous push forward. Nikos openly admitted that he suffered from depression, psychosis, and obsessive thoughts. Yet when he was with Jean, he felt happier and more content than he ever had before. It was as though she drove all the dark thoughts away. Harris asked whether Jean knew that her boyfriend was taking powerful medication to manage his mental health. Nikos reluctantly admitted that he had done everything possible to hide it from her. Consequently, when he spent entire days at Jean's home, he would at least miss the scheduled time for taking his medication, and sometimes he would not take it at all. Jean's diary shows that she was unpleasantly surprised to learn, only after their relationship had begun, that Nikos was receiving treatment and taking psychiatric medication. She believed he should have told her sooner. She certainly did not know that he sometimes failed to take his medication. Meanwhile, Nikos continued talking. While discussing Jean's death, he suggested that his former girlfriend had taken her own life. He explained his reasoning this way. If someone had killed her, she would have had bruises. For example, if she had been strangled, there would have been bruises on her neck. Or perhaps someone had grabbed her by the neck, pushed her underwater, and drowned her. Listening to the man speculate in this way is truly chilling because, apparently, something very similar may have happened to Jean. Finally, Harris Verman apparently even managed to draw a possible motive for Jean's murder out of him. Nikos had suspected Jean of having an affair with another man named Vangelis. No evidence of any such affair was ever found. So why had Nikos reached that conclusion? He had seen Jean and Vangelis talking and assumed they were romantically involved. The private detective's work resulted in a 29-page report that persuaded Greek prosecutors to reopen the case. 54-year-old Nikos Kotoulakis was arrested in 2025. His trial began on June 30th, 2026. It is safe to say that this was the final chance to secure justice for Jean. Time was rapidly running out. Only 3 years remained before the statute of limitations expired. If the case had failed to move forward during that time, her killer would most likely have escaped justice forever. According to Detective Harris Verman, it became clear during the trial that Nikos suffered from bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. Combined with prolonged alcohol and drug use, these conditions formed the components of a highly combustible cocktail. Witnesses were afraid to testify in court because they feared retaliation. The man's sister added another disturbing detail to his portrait. According to her, whenever her brother failed to take his medication, he became aggressive and violent. On one occasion, he had even tried to set their parents on fire. After an outburst of rage, he would suffer from amnesia. The prosecutor told the court that the motive for the crime had been rejection. Jean noticed something disturbing about Nikos and decided to end their relationship. But he saw things differently. He followed her, becoming her shadow. When he saw her speaking to another man, he became jealous and flew into a terrible rage. He beat his former girlfriend and threw her into the water. No DNA evidence was found in the case. No fingerprints were recovered. There was no confession. There were only 3 sons who refused to believe that their mother had simply fallen into the water. 17 years later, on July 3, 2026, Jean's sons finally heard the word, guilty. because of a provision allowing for diminished responsibility on mental health grounds, as Nikos was found to have had diminished capacity at the time of the crime. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Moreover, he remains free pending the outcome of his appeal. At present, the Greek media are not even permitted to publish his name. The British media, however, revealed both the man's name and his photographs long ago. For Jean's sons, the verdict was an enormous victory. They had proved that their mother was murdered and forced the Greek justice system to acknowledge the mistake it had made 17 years earlier. Jean's life was abruptly cut short just when she had finally decided to live for herself. Full of hope, ambition, and desire, she had written down her plans for the following day, as she always did. Jean was going to babysit a friend's child. She never arrived.